Great. Just to give a quick credit where it's due to Lauda's Foundation, who the sort of top categories that you see at the top of the slide there was put together by Lauda's Foundation after a lot of mapping and analysis of different organizations working to promote transparency in this in the apparel sector. So shout out to them for that. So as you can kind of see on this slide, the progress that's been made over the past decade on supply chain transparency in the apparel sector has really taken kind of a lot of different approaches and the work of a lot of organizations doing different but complementary work to sort of get there. One big category that we have is advocating for transparency, of course, pushing for companies and other actors to disclose this information and really just making the case for why it matters and why they should be making it publicly available. And there's sort of two broad categories, and we'll hear from Fashion Revolution sort of on the general public advocacy piece of it, looking at broader campaigns and public awareness raising about why it matters. And then from Paul from Clean Clothes Campaign about work on the Transparency Pledge, which was advocacy directed specifically at the data owners, so companies themselves, of course. But then once that advocacy is going on, we also need to be collecting and disclosing that data, and that's really where a lot of the work by companies themselves, looking at tracing their supply chains, putting it out there, and then also guidance from multi-stakeholder initiatives like the AGT sort of comes into play. Basically making sure that companies have the support and resources that they need to be able to disclose. And then finally, and this is probably a piece that maybe gets overlooked sometimes, is making sure that the data has somewhere to go and it's actually useful. And sort of under that category, we have work like Open Supply Hub, which I'm sure many of you have seen recently has expanded from Open Apparel Registry and now is going to be including data, supply chain data from a broad number of industries all in one place. And then the other pieces, of course, looking at improving data quality, which we have Mateen Abdullah from Mapped in Bangladesh to speak to that piece of sort of the work today. And sort of when all of this is done together and done well, and all these pieces are taken up, and that data that we end up getting that is useful ends up sort of flowing back in and feeding back into these other steps earlier on. Having useful data also makes advocacy for more transparency better. So it sort of creates this mutually reinforcing feedback loop. And then, overall, this sort of end goal and end result is shifting the whole system towards a more sort of equitable access to benefits for all in an equitable world. So there's a lot of different pieces that have gone into the progress, a lot of different organizations doing taking different approaches, looking at different targets. And, it really took pretty much every single one of us, not just in this call, but, countless others who are not here and who have been working on this for a long time to drive this progress that we've seen in the apparel industry. And of course, as I said, there's much more work that still needs to be done. And, but this initial sort of key learnings that we've been able to take away will be useful, we think, for organizations hoping to promote transparency in other sectors as well. So having just sort of briefly laid out a broad picture of the overarching formula and the ingredients that have gone into this progress, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who will be Liv Simpliciano from Fashion Revolution, to speak about sort of the state of play of transparency in the apparel sector and Fashion Revolution's work and role in sort of the progress that we've seen.
Thank you, Nicole, and hi, everyone. I think I'll first start with just an explanation on Fashion Revolution, and then I'll go into some of our key findings from our Global Fashion Transparency Index. So to start, I'm Liv, and I'm the Policy and Research Manager at Fashion Revolution. So my main job is to lead on our Global Fashion Transparency Index. So I research, write, and publish the report. So I'm the go-to person for transparency. And in terms of Fashion Revolution, as an organization, we're a global movement that was founded in 2014. Rana Plaza was our catalyzing moment, much for many of the other peer organization on this call, but we recognize the need for transparency. So this is something that we've campaigned for since 2014. So we aim to increase transparency in the industry, standing in solidarity with the people who make our clothes. We campaign for a fair, clean, transparent, and accountable fashion industry. And we believe that fashion should be a restorative and conservative force for the environment, and one in which values people and planet over profit. So we're truly a global movement, and we specifically advocate for cultural policy and industry change. So we do this through research, education, collaboration, mobilization, and advocacy. So for example, we have our hashtag Who Made My Clothes campaign, as well as our hashtag What's in My Clothes, which looks at the chemicals used in the production of our clothing, as well as our Who Made My Fabric campaign. So these campaigns are really for consumers, although we advocate that consumers are citizens first, so we call them citizens consumers, recognizing that they have power and that they should be curious and find out and do something. So these campaigns really help the transparency movement, as it enables more visibility and fewer barriers between consumers and the producers of our clothes. So I guess beyond this, the bread and butter of Fashion Revolution really is, our speciality really is taking complex issues and boiling it down to key messaging that is accessible, empowering, and actionable. So essentially, the hashtags that I mentioned before are tools that we create to help people use their voice and make changes in their personal lives and work, and also help people to understand the fashion industry's impact. So one of the key ways that we do this is through our Global Fashion Transparency Index, which we created in 2016. So the Fashion Transparency Index is an annual review of 250 of the world's largest brands and retailers, ranked according to the level of information that they disclose about their social and environmental policies, practices, and impacts in their own operations and supply chain across key issues like living wages, overconsumption, carbon emissions, water and waste management, and so on. So this is a tool to really push and incentivize the world's largest brands and retailers to be more transparent about their social and environmental efforts. And critically, our theory of change is that transparency is foundational to achieving systemic change in the fashion industry. It's a first step. By no means is this radical. It's necessary. And to be honest, transparency is really the bare minimum that brands can be offering us. And importantly, we do not assess sustainability. We only look at the information that's disclosed. Because when brands publicly disclose information, it allows anyone to scrutinize their policies, hold them accountable for their claims, and advocate for positive change. And from the feedback that we've had with the brands that we work with, so just as an example, our Fashion Transparency Index 2022, 62% of those brands actively engaged with us on the Fashion Transparency Index. And some of the feedback that we've had is that really for them, it acts as a to-do list for the industry. It helps them push the needle and really gives them a trajectory of where they should be in terms of transparency. And we've seen them disclose information on their websites in alignment with our methodology, in fact. So it's really a tool to leverage activism, and our research exposes the gaps in brands disclosure, which really forms the basis for some of the new legislation in the industry. So now I'm just going to turn to some of the stats from the FTI 2022 to really give a state of play, as Nicole was saying, in terms of transparency. So this year, our overall average score was 24%. That's up from 1% last year. We still see that most brands disclose on their commitments and less on their progress and impact across key issues, like I mentioned before, of living wages, overproduction, overconsumption, waste and water management, and so on. In terms of their traceability disclosure, more brands than ever are disclosing their first tier suppliers. So that's 48% of 250 are disclosing their first tier suppliers. So just to give a sense of the progress that we've made, is that in 2016, only 5 out of 40 major brands, so that's less than, I think that's like 13%, disclosed their suppliers, whereas today, 121 out of 250 disclose their first tier suppliers. So it's a huge progress that's been made, not only by Fashion Revolution's efforts, by others on this call as well. And to give a greater sense of the disclosure across the different tiers, 32% are disclosing their processing facilities and 12% at the raw material level. So importantly, what we find with our Fashion Transparency Index and the indicators that we have, it's not just about the disclosure of the information, but it's ensuring that that information is shared in a machine readable format, making it easier for affected stakeholders to take action on that data. So just as a quick example, in 2020, we had an indicator in the index around whether or not the information was shared in machine readable format. So just 10 out of 250 brands in 2020 did this. But for 2022, we find that 31% out of 250 are now disclosing information in machine readable format in alignments with the Open Data Standard. And this is through our efforts of aligning with the Open Supply Hub methodology and so on. And then finally, I know I've been talking for a while, is that I just want to say that in spite of this really great progress that we've made, our data still shows that half of the brands that we review disclose nothing in the traceability section. So this means half, literally 125 out of 250 score in the 0 to 1% range in traceability. So this really highlights the reticence of these brands that we've reviewed year on year to disclose information, which really makes the case for mandatory disclosure. So the legislative landscape is looking better for this. So hopefully we'll see greater disclosure next year and beyond. So that's a quick overview of that. I'm sure there'll be questions on this later, but I'll pass it on to our next panelist.
Yeah, and our next panelist, sort of staying in the advocating for supply chain transparency category, will be Paul Rowland from Clean Clothes Campaign, who of course is an instrumental part of the Transparency Pledge Coalition. So it'd be great to hear, Paul, from you about how our approach sort of differed from Fashion Revolution's and complemented their work as well.
Yeah, yeah. So my name is Paul Roeland. I work as the transparency lead for the Clean Clothes Campaign, which is a global grassroots network of working on labor rights and conditions in the garment industry. We're a network made of over 250 organizations, both in producer countries and in consumer countries, made up of trade unions, labor rights organizations, women's rights organizations, etc. And we've been active in the sector for over 30 years. One of the main avenues of work that we do is what we call urgent appeals, and that is direct solidarity with workers whenever their rights are violated, whenever there is an issue, could be a health and safety issue, could be union busting, could be any kind of direct. So the urgent appeal work is usually directly linked to a factory or several factories, and of course we also campaign on more systemic issues like living wages and a whole lot more. But yeah, for us also transparency was very important. Again, the Rana Plaza disaster was a real kicker because it took over a year to find out who was actually sourcing from there. And that involved literally people going through the rubble, which was the point where we said, this cannot happen ever again. So we started together with with 9 organizations together, global trade unions and non-profit organizations, the Transparency Pledge. We focused first on a few major brands. About 80 brands were in the first round that we targeted. We wrote directly to them. We spoke to them. We also coupled that with a publicity campaign using hashtags like Go Transparent. We worked together with Fashion Revolution on their work as well. But our focus was to talk directly to brands and also to responsible business initiatives and multi-stakeholder initiatives. And for us, it was really important to explain why transparency is such a necessary precondition for tackling many other problems. So for us, transparency is not a goal in and of itself. It is a means to an end, but it is absolutely necessary to have that linked to the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. There is no way a worker can get access to remedy, which is their right, if they don't know who they are working for. So in order to, if there is a case of, let's say, union busting, we need to know which brands to talk to, because the brands have leverage. They can then talk to the factory owner and say, like, this is explicitly not in our code of conduct. You need to change his behavior. So having that data available makes our work a lot faster, which is really important, because workers need that speed, because if they are sacked, or if they will have moved on if it takes 3 months to find out which brands you can engage to rectify the situation. So speed is of the essence, and that's why things like machine readability, standardized formats are incredibly important. And for those places where we do have that transparency now, it means our speed of starting to work on a case has gone from weeks and weeks to hours, and that makes really a big difference. So that's why we keep on focusing on transparency, and why we keep also on pushing for it in wider ways, in so that it remains structured, that it becomes standard, and that indeed together with others we will also keep on advocating that for the laggards, it will have to become mandatory at some point. We've now reached the point where many companies have shown that it's eminently possible to be transparent and still be very profitable. And that means that basically all the arguments against transparency have been debunked. They've been shown to be wrong in practice. So we can now say, like, well, this is now industry best practice, and this should now be made mandatory for everybody in there.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to transition, and we're running short on time, so I'm going to transition over to Floor from the former Dutch Agreement on Sustainable Garments and Textiles to speak about their work and role in this.
Thank you for having me. My name is Fleur Meerman, and I work for the Social and Economic Council of the Netherlands, which is the main advisory body to the Dutch government, in which employers, employees, and independent experts work together to reach agreement on key social and economic issues. So the SER advises the Dutch government and the parliament, but it also facilitates sectoral international responsible business conduct agreements. So these are negotiated agreements between the government, NGOs, unions, and business. Not always are all of them included, but in the ideal world, they are. And the last 5 years, I've been working for the Secretariat of the Dutch Agreement on Sustainable Garments and Textiles, also called the AGT. And the AGT ran until the 31st of December 2021. It ran for almost 6 years. And in the AGT, we're a broad coalition of business and the other organizations which I just mentioned. And they were working together to prevent pollution, promote animal welfare, and improve working conditions in producing countries and in supply chains. And transparency was the focus point and actually the key enabler in this process. And about 50% of the companies operating on the Dutch market were part of the agreement, and this really helped us push the sector in the right direction in terms of transparency. I would like to share a bit about what that then meant. So the parties to the agreement, they all agreed that companies would have to or would need to provide supply chain transparency during the term of the agreement. However, there was a step-by-step process. So for the first year, companies had to provide their first year production locations to the Secretariat. And then what we did is we merged all the lists that we received, which were around 90 brands. And we tried to make one list out of that and try to map manually which locations were the same. but due to translation, the way of registering information was an extremely time-consuming process. And then this aggregated list, we published that on our website for stakeholders to use. Well, first of all, we found that it was very difficult for stakeholders to find us, so that the list was there, and then also to use it. So actually, quite quickly after we published this first list, we got in touch with Open Apparel Registry, or now Open Supply Hub, and they said they had an idea on how to automate this process. So they first wanted to convince us to join, and then I said, no need. We've done the manual mapping, and we see that it's not used the way we envisioned the data to be used. So we started working with Open Apparel Registry, and this really helped us to bring all the data into one point. But I think Natalie will tell a bit more about how Open Supply Hub works after me. So this was really good. So that was a requirement for the first year, but then companies were obliged as of the third year at minimum to give production location information deeper down the chain. So companies kind of had like, a 5.5 years where they could kind of increase their transparency, and that really worked. And we did not only focus on just providing a list, but we also really focused on, okay, what process do you need to set up to get structural insight in your production locations? So one of the things that we did, we made a format. I also put it in a chat, which indicated which indicators you would, what information you needed to collect, and some of them were mandatory and others were not mandatory, but strongly encouraged if you want to set up a good due diligence system. And I think, so the agreement was negotiated. So the aggregated list what was negotiated, but companies were obliged to set up a good due diligence system. So at the core, you would actually need to have as much transparency as you can. So we actively promoted companies to individually publish their production data as well. So that was considered like a good practice. And Clean Clothes campaign is very active in the Netherlands, and they also play quite a big role in, I think, creating awareness at top level on the needs. So we also saw that companies were really scared of Clean Clothes campaign. So what we kind of try to do is try to work together with Clean Clothes campaign and the Transparency Pledge to kind of reward brands that were giving supply chain transparency instead of only like kind of the negative campaigning. And I think that also worked quite well. When we started the agreement, there were only like 3 or 4 companies that signed the Transparency Pledge, and a few more that were also sharing their production location data themselves. At the end of the agreement, so after 5.5 years, about 70% of the production locations that were on the aggregated list were also to be found at individual level with companies. And I think one of the good things also is that after the AGT ended, a lot of companies started producing or publishing their information as well, because they kind of had confidence that it was bringing them something and it was not just scary and it was not only used for campaigning, but would help them in their due diligence. I could speak a lot more. I don't know if I've covered the main points, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to share them or to answer them.
Okay, thank you, Fleur. We're going to turn next to Mateen from Mapped in Bangladesh to hear about their work and the key role they play in making sure the data that's coming out is actually usable. So Mateen, over to you.
Hi, I don't know if you guys know about the project, so I'll start with a brief background. Mapped in Bangladesh was like, is a project under the Center for Entrepreneurship at BRAC University. It started in 2017 with the grants from Lotus Foundation. We have started the second phase funded by Lotus and GICAD. Now, for the last 5 years, our focus has been to collect, curate, and publish information and to create tools and strategies how to do that, right? So what information are we publishing? This is from the what you may call it, export-oriented factories in Bangladesh. So the way that Mapped in Bangladesh is different is we are collecting similar information, but at different node in the supply chain, right? So we are at the supplier level collecting the information and publishing it. So that is how, not from the brand itself. So there are two focus areas that we have usually. One is coverage, meaning that is the breadth of information we try to cover. That is, we are always trying to expand. One is all export-oriented factories in Bangladesh and different kinds of data. So we are trying to expand to social and environmental data points at this moment. And the other aspect of it is that we are focusing on is, since we are a live website, reducing the update cycle. So because it takes a while to collect this information, clean it, and update and publish. So we have recently sort of like piloted a crowdsourcing app, and we have got a very good response from the suppliers. So that is good news. So we see ourselves as part of an ecosystem with all the organizations who are here represented by the different panelists. For example, we regularly publish to Open Supply Hub, previously Open Apparel Registry. So even at this level, although it doesn't sound very exciting, some of the experiences we had, I wanted to share so that if it needs to be implemented in different aspects, different industries. One of these experience was the Suppliers and Suppliers Association, when we started the data collection, did not warm up to the concept in the beginning. So it took some time, but for us, it was lucky that they came around. Of course, Rana Plaza was a big catalyst for that. And some of the surprises we had are, for example, since we collect this information directly from the suppliers in Bangladesh, we deem this data to be their property. So when we publish it with their consent. Now, some of the brands came along and said that, well, you cannot put my name on that factory's profile because we don't work with them, right? So we went to the supplier, and we initially thought it would be a no-brainer. The factory would say that remove that brand's name, but it was surprising to see the supplier push back and said, no, you can't remove that because I have this guy's clothes on the factory floor at this moment, right? So we had to start a thing called disputed. So we put a marker on there to say disputed, so that and another experience, very recent experience is, I have to get the designation right. One of the largest US brands, regional responsible sourcing manager, visited our office. The brand revenue is more than $11 billion a year. So he came into the office and told us that you need to change the way you collect information. So we said, okay, what's your advice? And he said that first, whenever a factory reports a brand, you need to check with us, right? You need to go to the official list of brands suppliers that we publish and make sure that if it is not there, first check with us, then you can publish the information. So we told him that we have a process for that. Similar to Wikipedia, we have sort of like a suggest and edit process. So that is, and if that triggers sort of like, again, we go to the factory and ask and things like that, the whole dispute thing. And immediately he went to what legal framework are you operating under? So it's basically not so subtle, but it happens. So even, I mean, so any kind of supply chain information that is not sort of like published by the, what can I say, the lead firm would be challenged. So that's one of the things that we expect. So I would just summarize that our goal is to provide supply chain information collected at from a different node in the chain, right? Not from the lead firms of the value chain, right? And our goal is to put as much as dots that we can on the board, so our friends in this panel can connect the dots and tell the stories better. So that's Mapped in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatin. And then last but not least, over to Natalie from Open Supply Hub.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for everyone else's great explanations. I think I can be super short, so we can have more time for Q&A too. So Open Supply Hub, formerly known as Open Apparel Registry, is an accessible collaborative supply chain mapping tool used and populated by stakeholders across sectors and across supply chains. And our goal is to open up supply chain data for the benefit of all. The core tech behind what we do is that we clean up, standardize, and make accessible this data contributed by stakeholders, as well as public data sets that we find out there. And the data set is centered on a key set of information: production locations and supply chains, including the name of the facility, address, GPS coordinates, sector, and then you can see the ecosystem around each facility, the contributors who've affiliated and associated themselves with the facility. And contributors can also upload additional data points about a facility, like facility processing type, processing activities, parent companies, product type. And then finally, on each facility, you have this visibility that you can see the different organizations affiliated with that facility, which helps to facilitate collaboration. So we launched in 2019 with a focus on apparel with 8,000 facilities, and we've grown since then, as mentioned previously, to cover broader retail supply chains. We have over 138,000 facilities in the database now, and stakeholders contributing data to the tool include organizations like Amazon, Target, Disney, HEMA, civil society organizations like Worker Rights Consortium, Electronics Watch, Mapped in Bangladesh, some of the participants today, factory groups and service providers. So in this ecosystem, we play this role of making the data usable and facilitating collaboration. And what we want to see from this, and that what I think we've seen in apparel, is this momentum behind this unprecedented data sharing and collaboration that comes off of the heels of the transparency. To the points earlier, it's not just the exercise of transparency in itself, it's what can be done with the data as a result by partners. Super quickly, in terms of specific efforts that we've worked on, we're a 501c3 nonprofit with a multi-stakeholder board of directors. So we really play a pre-competitive role as a public good. We collaborate with civil society, brands and retailers, facilities alike. But two things that I think we've done that I can speak directly to what I think has been successful in apparel is one, pushing for consensus around data standards. So that ODSAS, Open Data Standard for Apparel Supply Chains that we linked earlier, help to set a standard for everyone. This is what we want to see in terms of transparency, and here's the format you should put it in. And that was in partnership with Transparency Pledge, Clean Clothes Campaign, WikiRate. And then 2, behind the scenes, we've worked with larger data holders, service providers, bigger brands, to help clean and standardize their data so that they're also a part of the transparency conversation, right? Because it's not just brands and retailers, to Mateen's point, that hold data around supply chains that can help to further this, all of our collective goals. There's other big data sets out there. So I'll stop there and we can dive into the other questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, I know many of the speakers have already sort of started to touch on key lessons and takeaways, but I want to sort of hone in on that now. So we'll turn back to each of the speakers and turn to sort of ask the question of, if you were replicating this work in other sectors, what's 1 or maybe 2 things that worked really well that you would for sure replicate, and 1 thing that you would watch out for and be aware of, maybe if it's a challenge or something that was unexpected that came up. Yeah, we'll start with Fleur this time around.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of lessons, but I think one of the things that really worked well for the AGT is that, if there's hesitance in a sector to start publishing supply chain data, that to start on an aggregated level works quite well, because then as a group, you start to publish and then you see the effects. And so far, none of the brands that have started publishing, I've not heard any of the brands that have started publishing that regret it or say it hasn't brought me anything. So the fact that you're publishing and as a group, and maybe step by step, I think that would be a main lesson for other sectors maybe as well. I think also really thinking about, okay, if you're going to be transparent as a sector or as an individual company, that really to make sure like, okay, how can your stakeholders actively use it? So I think what Natalie was saying, I think Open Supply Hub is a great go-to place for stakeholders to use. And I think that's really going to help. But I mean, if you're going to start publishing, make it meaningful and not just put it a list somewhere on your website where you have to click a few times. And I think another important part is, I mean, ask yourself the question, why are you being transparent? And is it really to improve your due diligence system? And if it is, then include your stakeholders, NGOs, like inform them on that you're doing it and how they can contact you if they have questions, so that they know, how to reach you in case they have issues or, if there's something. I think I'll leave it with that for now.
Thanks so much, Fleur. Liv, could you share your response on this?
Sure. So I agree with Fleur, but I think from our perspective, what I would say is, as an advocacy organization, I think one of the things that we've done successfully is communicating that we are firstly citizens. I think corporations out there would have us believe that we exist on this earth to consume, and that's it. So I think one of the successes at Fashion Revolution is really honing in on that citizen action. So I think through our research and focusing solely on transparency for the FTI, the data and the research that we produce really gives you the I don't want to say sound bites, but the sound bites to like leverage your activism. So the way that we present our research, it's not complicated. It's meant to be like easily understood and digestible and widely shared. So I think one of the things that we've really done successfully is communicating those complex issues. And in terms of just how we run our campaigns themselves, I think, as I mentioned before, what's been really key for us is highlighting the human element. So through our hashtag Who Made My Clothes, hashtag What's in My Clothes, and Who Made My Fabric campaigns, what that's really done has enabled visibility and reduced the barriers between citizens / consumers and producers. And I think fostering that human element and connection is really important for a campaign, because I think for many people, I know we're all living inside of a bubble in this industry, but for many people, the vastness and scope and size of the fashion industry is absolutely unfathomable. And I think being able to establish that connection and foster that human element and connection and visibility of that is really important. And I think finally, just the very last thing I'll say is with the work that we do with the Fashion Transparency Index and our methodology, which I think will be really important moving forward, as someone commented, or with the incoming legislation and greater demands for transparency, is really having alignment and harmonization, because we don't want to be reinventing the wheel. We want to make sure that we're not working against the efforts of others and towards this movement of reducing the human rights and environmental impact of the industry. So I think, having discussions and collaborating with our peers is really important moving forward. So yeah, I'll pass it on to someone else next. Thank you.
Great, yeah. Mateen, do you want to jump in and add your thoughts?
Yes, I guess from our point of view, since we are collecting data on the ground, the first thing to consider is context, right? So where you are and understand the stakeholders. So you have to push, but you have to push understanding where you can make headway, right? It takes a while. So that is one of the things you have to keep at it for a while to expand, but it comes around. I mean, people understand at the end the value of transparency. That is what we saw in the supplier community and in Bangladesh. The other thing is to be willing to experiment, right? Because over and over again, because there are different aspects of data collection and how we can collect better data faster. That aspect of it is there, and do a proper stakeholder mapping so that you understand how the dynamics changes, so that so the collection process doesn't get bogged down. And it takes a bit, so we walk quite a thin line between advocacy and data collection. So we are sort of like at the bottom of the transparency cycle that Nicole showed. So I guess to define your role, to understand what you're doing is quite important in to create an organization or a data repository like this. Thank you.
Thanks, Mateen. Now on to Natalie.
So 2 things for me. One is, I think that the different groups on this call and the different roles that we play speak volumes in terms of the success. Everyone was playing a different role in terms of trying to cultivate this transparency ecosystem. And I think it is important to sort of, if you are working on bringing transparency to your sector, it's important not to try and do it alone, right? Think about who are the other partner organizations who share your goals, who are working and get together and collaborate and listen to each other. So that's one thing. And then I think the second thing I just draw a line under is standardization. If you say to everyone, okay, we want everyone in, whatever industry to be transparent, but you don't define exactly what it is, provide templates, spell out exactly, here are the categories by which we want you to disclose, you're going to end up with a bunch of data that's virtually just unusable. So standardization and common agreement on what that standard should look like, I think is really important. And making sure that you're involving, to Mateen's point, I just want to emphasize that too, is the stakeholder mapping and involving different stakeholders, understanding the perspective of the different stakeholders who hold the data in your sector and what are the limitations and challenges that they face potentially in terms of data collection or in terms of publishing the data. Because there are a lot of pros, but in some cases there are reasons which Paul can speak more to around why a particular organization might not want to disclose their affiliation with a facility. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, the question, there are indeed reasons where you should watch out with transparency that can have to do with if you are expanding into things like smallholder farms, people who actually also live there, then you actually have to deal with GDPR and other privacy requirements. But there's also, there can be cases where a lot of information, a lot of workers are from specific minority, can be an ethnic or religious or a migration status minority, that could actually harm those people if you start publishing that. So you always have to keep an eye out for possible bad consequences. One other thing I really want to stress for people that want to work in, start to work in other sectors, is the openness of the data. That is so key, because that is what allows other systems to be built on it. I saw some questions in the chat already about new technologies like blockchain and isotope testing. Having one ID, the open supply ID, makes those others, building those other systems on top of that, makes that possible. So this is, you first have to sort of agree on a basic identifier. That already is difficult enough, but that allows people to combine that data with other kinds of data, with volume data, with transactional data, like what shipment goes where, or in our case, with violations data. We have an internal database of violations. We can now combine that linked on the OAR ID, or the open supply ID. So that then becomes a key linking factor for different databases. That also allows expansion in the future. It's not something that you will ever be done with. There will be new data coming, there will be new categories of data, but having that standardization, but also the open license, allowing others to build on it freely, that really allows for building preparedness for the future. That allows to say, like, okay, whatever is relevant in 5 years, we can still use this data. We have built a solid foundation, and now you can really start making more use of it. And that's also a key takeaway, because that's what when we started, everybody thought we were crazy. So we forgot a little bit to plan for success. We were like, okay, we're going to campaign really hard for transparency. And then suddenly we had transparency and we were like, oops. But, oh, sorry, we meant it should be standardized, because now you're publishing PDFs and it's useless. And we hadn't quite thought through how to deal with historical lists. So just be bold and plan for success. Say, like, okay, this is totally going to work. And how are we going to make it so that all the technical building blocks are there to make it really useful? Because that's really what we want. We want it to be useful for all kinds of stakeholders. And yeah, with like what the Open Supply Hub has done is building a really good fundament for that, where others can then improve on, use freely, and extend.
Great, thanks, Paul. We have about 6 minutes left. We have, I'll pose maybe a couple of questions that came through all at once, and ask you all to respond if you'd like to, and then we can close. The questions that came through are: could panelists talk to the role of data and increase supply chain transparency? And Paul, you already started speaking to this one. What are the challenges ahead in terms of digitization and accessible data for companies? And what does data capability look like now for most companies? And what would data infrastructure look like in an ideal state? So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on any of those right away, or.
I could speak a bit on that. So I think in general, what we've seen with the companies that have been part of the Dutch agreement, that just collecting the data or registering the data before publishing is really challenging, because many of the companies have like old systems in place, and a lot of companies are kind of trying to chip in to make it easier for companies to get the supply chain transparency and to link it to products that they're buying, but it is challenging. We've spoken over the years with several blockchain startups, but we haven't found the silver bullet yet. So it might be that it's there, but we haven't seen it yet. Maybe it doesn't really answer the question, but what I'm thinking about for other industries, like it really starts at top management. Like top management really needs to understand why it's important to have the transparency. And once a commitment is there, then there needs to be an investment in IT to kind of capture the data structurally before you start publishing it. So that's also still an advice. Like if you're looking into it for other sectors, start with the top and invest in IT. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I think, what an ideal future would look like is to also have what is in technical terms called API access. That basically means computers talking to each other. That would allow a lot more things to scale up. There are already a few brands that actually publish their supplier list on a daily or even an hourly basis because they have connected to their internal business systems. So that is a way forward, because more and more brands will start having that kind of technology, and having a well-defined open API will allow those kinds of collaborations to be on a much larger scale, to be much quicker, and to be much more efficient. So that is what data infrastructure to me in an ideal state would look like, because we should have that much data available that it's not possible for a few humans to maintain it. That should be mostly automated. And then we should also start using things like machine learning to find out patterns, to find out irregularities, to find out where things could be improving. That's to me what the future will hold and what the future will bring. And having that kind of technology would also allow other actors to start making that information available. For instance, reducing it down to a very simple data set for workers, because workers could be your most powerful auditors ever. They are the ones that work in a factory. So if you can show them really simply on their phone, like, these are the brands that claim that they produce at you, is that the case? Because you are making their stuff. That becomes effective at sort of like, checking at scale. And that is what, to me, an ideal future looks like, where workers are becoming part of an ecosystem of empowerment and where they can actually also play a role. But for that, we also need to adapt technology so that it works on a mobile phone, so that it works in local languages. But for that, we need the data to be there, and then we need user-friendly UX and UI to make that available.
Wonderful. If anyone wants to come in for 30 seconds, otherwise we can probably wrap up. Natalie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was going to say, to build off Paul's point and actually answer another question further on around, can we just have one database that has everything in it? That the APIs that Paul is talking about, where the computers are talking to each other, like Mapped in Bangladesh talks to Open Supply Hub, right? That's the world where you have that open database, but also to the question earlier, what does the future look like? Brands are hoping to have like a single supplier dashboard where you've got a facility and you're pulling in all this data from all the different platforms and programs you're involved in. And so the APIs will allow that to happen, but also create the opportunity for civil society to be able to not have to check against databases, but looking and mapped in Bangladesh, click on a facility, take you to the Open Supply Hub record, be able to then see what Open Supply Hub has, then click over to the fashion checker, right? That's the world that we're building towards, where all these databases are talking to each other.
Great, thanks, Annalie. I think, we're at time, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. I want to say thanks to all of our great speakers for the wonderful discussion today, and thanks also to Hannah Lennett at Open Supply Hub, who did a lot of the work to get this up and running. So thanks for that. And thanks to all of you for attending and joining us. We hope we learned a lot. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.